Watch a movie, get inspired, give back, help a charity. It's time for a Movikarma watch party.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Movikarma watch party. My name is Jared Milrad. As everyone knows, this is a place where we try to celebrate creatives and artists who are making a difference through the power of story, film, and other forms of art. So today I'm really excited to have our special guest, Kimberly Jones, who's a best-selling author, an activist, a filmmaker, a writer, doing lots of amazing stuff. So Kimberly, welcome to the show.
Hello there. I'm like super excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being on. So we have a lot to get to. Probably a couple million questions for you, Kimberly, but we'll try to narrow it down. So I'd love to just, well, first of all, I was struck when I saw that you're a fan of synthetic wigs and nail art, which I think is so cool.
Yeah.
Anything going on today you got any nail art going on or anything fun?
No real nail art today. Just because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to go to my nail technician. The one that I go to, she's amazing. She like started out like as an artist, like as a graphic designer, and got into like nail art. So she can, anything that you can think of, she can put on your nails. Like if you wanted to put, I don't know, ducktails on your nails, she could like put that on there. So I haven't been able to see her due to the pandemic. I'm all like chipped and sad.
No, you have to update us.
But I do have purple hair, so that part is in place.
That is rocking. Yeah, my mom has purple hair, so we are fans of purple in this household. Yeah, that is rocking. I hope you get compliments on that because she does all the time.
Like, yeah, people love it.
Yeah, like brighten their day. Like what? So again, super excited to have you here. I think first of all, you wrote this book. I guess about a year ago it was released, right? I Am Not Dying with You, which, as I understand, is kind of a young adult book. I had a chance to read quite a bit more about it. I'd love if you could just kind of tell us a little bit more to start off how that book came to be, and curious too. I know you had a co-author in the book, and I'm kind of curious before we dive into what the book's about. How that relationship came to be and how sort of that happened.
Yeah, so my co-author, Gilly Segal, this book was actually her idea. She and I had been friendly. We had been in a book club together called the Not So YA Book Club. That's a book club for adult women who like to read YA. And so there were a lot of writers in that group. And one of the things we used to do as a group was go on writing retreats. So she and I became very friendly, like on writing retreats, and we had a lot in common. But we weren't like quite friendly enough to like have each other's phone numbers. But we shared space a lot, and so I at the time was managing a children's bookstore called Little Shop of Stories, and she came into the bookstore one day, and she was kind of like milling around, and she's a lawyer by trade. She's a trademark lawyer. And so she had like her bulleted list. And if people get to know Gilly, this story makes all the sense in the world to them. She had like this bulleted list of how she was going to convince me to write this book with her, right? And so she started down her list, and I think she got to like bullet 2, and I was like, "You had me at let's write together." So we had like our Jerry Maguire moment. But what had sparked her to want to write this book was she saw a news clip in 2015, because we started writing it in 2015, right after the death of Freddie Gray and the unrest that happened in Baltimore. She saw this news clip about how when the protests started, the city knew the protests were about to start. And so they did a couple things that didn't make sense together. One was that they closed down schools early and told kids to go home, which that part made sense. But then they closed public transportation. And a lot of the high school kids in Baltimore take public transportation to get home. So there was this fast news clip of these kids in Baltimore who got trapped behind a police barricade. And Gilly and I are both moms, so she got completely struck by this idea that kids who weren't necessarily involved in the protest were just kind of stuck out there because they had no way to get home. And so that's when she got the idea for this book and came to me and had her bulleted list to convince me to write it.
Right, and obviously the bullet list, I guess, worked. Like you said, pretty quickly. So you started writing in 2015. It struck me just reading a lot of the press around the book and what people were saying about the book, that now it's sort of, I don't know if you feel like it's having kind of a moment right now, the story that you tell in the book, but obviously it's been relevant for, you know,
A
very
while.
long time, right?
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about, without giving too much away, but sort of about the thrust of the book? And I know that a lot of what's in the book is really, to me, about connection and about seeing our differences, and then seeing and like celebrating those, but seeing how important they are to work through, particularly in moments like these, and I think particularly for young people. So I just love to hear you, maybe share just a little bit about what the book really is about.
Yeah, so the book is about two 17-year-old girls, one black and one white, who survived the night in the midst of riots. And so, again, like those kids in Baltimore, these are not two girls who are participating in the protest. These are two girls who just, through no fault of their own, just found themselves in the midst of this situation. And they're not friends. They don't know each other prior to the start of the book. The book takes place over about a 4-hour period, so it's very quickly paced, and it's about how they try to survive the night. And it's told in alternating voices. So you get Campbell is the white girl's character, and Lena is the black girl's character. And so I predominantly wrote Lena, who's black, and Gilly predominantly wrote Campbell, who's white, and Gilly is white. And so we wanted people to see how differently they see the same night. However, we often say that this book is more about perspective than it is about race, because despite the fact that they may have different perspectives on things because of their race, they have the same perspective on a lot of things because they're both female. And so that omnipresent threat to the female form is what bonds them together and helps them to recognize that they need to survive the night. We often say if either of these characters had been male or male presenting, you would not have a book. Like, it would have ended at like chapter 2.
Wow. So that the power of gender and identity as a thread through even overcoming the force of race in the story,
exactly,
in a way. And yet those differences, obviously. Did you feel like writing the voice of Lena, that her identity as a black, female identified woman was though at times different than what Campbell was saying? Did you feel that coming out as well when you were writing?
Yeah, that definitely was true. And we wanted to talk about that, but we wanted to dig into more of their perspective being nurtured around their lived experience, and how each of their lived experience informed how they saw the community and their neighborhood, because they both live in this neighborhood, but their lived experiences is informing how they're seeing it and how they're identifying it. And Lena definitely, they both did. Both Lena and Campbell both have some perspectives that are, based on their like racial lived experience. And so they do have to grapple with that with each other, which meant that Gilly and I had to grapple with that while we were writing. And so we like to say that we created not a safe space, but a brave space where we were allowed to have the conversations necessary in order to keep everything authentic to the girls. And we even created a safe word that we used, that when one of us said that safe word, it meant, okay, what I'm about to ask you in normal company could probably be deemed ignorant, but that it's truly coming from a place of ignorance, and that we both knew we would never have any intent on harming each other. So we just need to kind of like brace the person, like, okay, we'd say the safe word and be like, okay, don't be offended by what's about to come out of my mouth next, but I need to ask this question or form this point in order to, stay true to what was happening. And for the most part, that helped us to maintain our relationship, because we definitely, now we're like, super dear friends. We've grown so close together since then, over the past 5 years of this experience. She's like a sister to me now. But at the onset of writing this, we were just friendly and not friends, and so we had to develop that relationship. But we knew that we wanted to have a friendship, and that we would always need to put the friendship first in order to survive this. And that's not to say that we didn't have days where we're like, girl, I can't stand you and I need like 48 hours away from you, because we did, but it was actually very rare. And that just came from like spending way too much time together, because we wrote side by side, so we would be together like all the time. So I think it was less about what was being put on the page and more about, I'm exhausted with just my saturated time with you.
Right. You're like sisters at that point, or like long-term relationship. Yeah.
Exactly.
Intense. Do you think something like, because the safe word concept is interesting in the context that you're describing it, like, do you think that something like that would be useful on a broader scale. Maybe, I don't know if we have a universal safe word as a country, but I do sometimes wonder, if we're, especially in this moment, other moments, not only around race, but, being even a gay dude, like I know there's so many times where people have said to me, Jared, I want to ask you this question about, being gay, but I don't know how to ask it. Like I feel like we're walking on eggshells a lot of times around each other.
Yeah.
Do you think something like that or some way to enable people to ask some of those questions would be healthy as a society?
Yeah, I think it would definitely be healthy, but I think, again, it has to come from a place of trust and love. So I don't think it could be universal, like you could just like be at dinner one night and use the universal safe word and ask a person a question. But I think that I think it's a great way in relationships and friendships, right, to nurture that kind of authentic conversation. So I think if you have a pre-existing relationship with someone and you've grown to trust each other and that person has no intent to like do you harm, I think I mean, Gilly and I are like fine with people running off with that. You know what I mean? Because it really did help us to have some really difficult conversations, have some tough conversations, and we learned a lot from it. Like that's the most important side, is that on the most important thing is that on the other side of that was growth. And sometimes growth comes from discomfort. And sometimes you have to live and sit in that discomfort to grow. But I think people should do that. And I think that that's why it's important that people diversify their friend group so that they have those kind of relationships where they could have those kind of like difficult conversations and learn and grow.
Yeah, otherwise there's just sort of stagnation that happens, right, where we we have a plateau.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, Kimberly, about your history with literature. We were really fascinated that you chose to write. I don't know if you chose intentionally or you just interested in writing for this particular YA audience, but that would just be interesting, I think, for us to hear a little bit about like how that came to be, why you feel like this is the right audience for this story, or if that's just the kind of work that you like to do in general.
It really is the kind of work that I like to do, particularly because I feel like some of the best conversations in the world are happening in the YA genre. And I think that they're happening in a more raw and truthful way. Because when you think about teenagers and what they're going through as they are developing, they are having these conversations for the first time. So they are having these conversations with the most pure intent of discovery, which is not necessarily what's happening with adults. Adults are often having conversations to make their point, but not to listen, to learn, to understand. Whereas kids are often having conversations to listen, to learn, and understand. So I felt like this type of narrative, where that's exactly what needed to happen, would be more truthful in teenagers than it would be in like two 40-year-old women trying to brave the night. Also, two 40-year-old women trying to brave the night would be less interesting because kids often overestimate getting trouble and underestimate real danger. So there are moments in the book where they are more concerned about getting in trouble than they are being in danger. And I remember that as a kid, right? Like and it's funny because I was having these conversations with one of my dear friends, Brandy, and she was talking about a night where like she walked through, a dark neighborhood that she shouldn't have been in, as opposed to calling her mom, because she was more fearful of calling her mom and getting in trouble for that than like you could get like robbed or murdered, or you know what I mean? Being out this late, being a young girl by yourself, that kind of thing. And so it sets the stage for a more interesting adventure, if you will, because of the youth. So I really like writing in that genre for that reason, because of the discovery. And also too, just like the canon in YA right now is the fastest growing canon of diversity. When you talk about seeing characters that are people of color, that are queer, that are capable, the YA genre has kind of like led the conversation on that. I think they're leading it at a much faster pace than adult literature. And I think that like middle grade books and picture books are like right behind them. But I think kid lit as a whole, whether it's picture books, middle grade, early readers, YA, are really having a more diverse conversation and really expanding the canon in a much more vast way than adult literature.
Do you have a thought as to why that is? I mean, you kind of touched on it, I think, in your last answer, but I wonder if there are specific reasons why the YA genre is leaning ahead I mean, I definitely relate to what you said around, that fear of getting in trouble. And maybe that's some of the reason that there's some universality to some of the YA experiences, obviously differences within color and queerness and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But, I just, as you were saying that, I think there's some universality there of my mom's going to kill me if I do this. And especially as a kid of a single mom, like you're getting a lot of head nods here, where it's like, mom is the biggest threat.
Exactly.
Well, like I had a mom who took me to, she's like, we're going to military school. Like if you don't get your act together. Right? Like, right. So like, is that part of it, that there's some universality in the YA experience, maybe that speaks to why it's even more progressive than others?
I definitely think so, but I think one of the things that I'm most proud about of being part of this kidlit community is that they're intentional in wanting to do it, right? So they're not saying, oh, we should expand the canon beyond like dead white straight men and just giving lip service to it. There's actually programming that has been put in place to make sure that that's what we're doing, because we know that kids need these stories. We know how difficult it is growing up, a Black kid, a Latin kid, or a queer kid, and never seeing yourself on the page, like never, like David Levithan is probably one of my favorite writers. And I remember even just 10 years ago when he first started writing, and I remember it was like a big, like people act like it was a big deal that he had this cover with two boys kissing, and the book was called Two Boys Kissing. And it was like this notion that queer kids don't deserve to see themselves in a love story the same way in which straight kids do. It's like it's so ridiculous and massively insulting, you know what I mean? And so it's like the kidlit community has been very clear and intentional about the fact that it was during those developmental years when we didn't see ourselves on the page, or we didn't experience diversity of someone who was different from us on the page, which sculpted those views that allowed, kind of a breeding ground for ignorance. And so we have organizations like We Need Diverse Books, and that's probably the biggest one. But there's dozens of them whose intentionality is about making sure that we expand the canon to involve everybody, because there's an amazing picture book writer named Dr. Brianna McDaniel who talks about the fact that the library is infinite. You don't have to like, okay, we have our one Black story this year, we have our one queer story this year, we have our one Latinx story. There's like, no, we all live lives, and some of them doesn't have to be centered around our experiences. It could just be like, a Black kid who likes sneakers, and there's like this whole story about their hunt for the sneakers. It doesn't always have to be rooted in our trauma or your coming out tale or whatever the case may be. And so, the kid world recognized that the kids need that, because that's where they're learning bad behaviors. That's where they're learning these false narratives, not only about other people, but that's where we're teaching kids false narratives about themselves that they then have to struggle with. So I think that the reason that kidlit, I went all the way around the bend and back again.
No,
I think that the reason why kidlit is leading the charge on that is by design and intent, and not wanting to give lip service, and creating programs where the pressure is being put on publishing houses. It's going well now. It started like 10 years ago where the pressure was being put on the publishing houses to say, expand the canon. It's not that hard. Just expand the canon.
Yeah. And I love that you pointed out intentionality. It didn't just happen by accident that there is more inclusion, and also that there's less, as you said, like less almost like segmentation and kind of one-offness to literature. That it's Black History Month, so this is the only time we get Black.
Exactly.
I was going to ask about parents, because I feel like, I'm sure you've had, I bet, many interesting conversations with parents around your book and some of the other work you've done. Like, what role do you think parents have in being, maybe adding to that intentionality of, hey, there's a full universe of human experience out there. We should be reading about it and learning about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've talked to like a lot of my friends, and we talk about how like parents want us to like give them the gold sticker. They see us at events and they're like, my kid read your book. And I told them they have to like read more stuff, and like, can you give me more recommendations of that kind of
Mm.
stuff? And it's like, that's the moment in which I'm like most excited to like lean in and do exactly what they want to do, right? Because I think the part of what we have to get past as like marginalized people is, even we, and I'm gonna get in a whole lot of trouble for saying this. Oh my God, I'm about to get
Okay.
myself in
Here
trouble
we
with
go.
my big mouth. We at some point, those of us who are creators and those of us who have taken the face of being like voices in the community, have to take the chip off of our shoulder and say, okay, I've positioned myself in this way where I've said that I will be a person who will be the voice to help guide people along the way. Now, should you be text messaging to your neighbor right now and ask them what they can do as an ally? No, do not text Fran next door and ask her what you need to do in your allyship. That is not her responsibility. Like, you got the same Google I got. Google some stuff and learn some stuff. But for those of us who have taken that responsibility, who've taken that burden on to say, okay, as a writer, as a creator, as a political pundit, as a newscaster, as a whoever who said, I'm going to give voice to these moments, then we've taken on that responsibility, and we have to be okay with educating people. Because the other thing, when it comes to marginalized community, we can't trust people who are not like us to guide the conversations, because who knows where they'll guide those conversations to. You know what I mean? So we have to be more intentional about that. So yeah, so I have amazing conversations with parents. Because keep in mind, like, Black people are only 13% of the population in the U.S. So I've gone into schools and in communities where there are no Black people in that town, like, not even jokingly, like there's no Blackness anywhere. Their entire view on Blackness is from what they've seen on television. And so I feel like literature is a great way, and art in general is a great way, if done correctly, of introducing people to perspectives and lived experiences that they've never seen before. And so then I'm intentional about having conversations with those parents, because I know that their experience with me is not going to change their whole life. I don't give myself that much credit, but what I can do is put them in the right direction to go seek more information on their own once that exchange with me has ended. And they're raising the kid, right? So the kids are often mimicking what they see and hear from their parents. So if I can start working with the parents to have a better view and a wider lens, then they can transfer that to the kid.
And I wonder down the road, maybe this hasn't happened yet, but if, like, 5, 10, 20 years from now, you're getting letters and emails from kids who are then like, thank you, or this shifted because you shifted my mom or my dad, or because I read your work. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, like, because you mentioned this just a moment ago, what you're sort of sharing with parents in those moments. Are you encouraging them to read specific work other than your own, or are you saying this is the kind of work you should be, educating yourself on and with your kids? Or how does that, what kind of, are you giving them action items, in other words? Or?
Yeah, I'm definitely giving them action items and telling them, first of all, I usually start with my book, because that's what the conversation is centered around. And then I'll give them a list of like similar things that they could read. But I'm also asking them like other stuff that they're reading, because I'm like, okay, I've given you this list of like amazing Black authors that you should read. But now here are some great Latinx authors that I'm a fan of. Here are some great Asian authors that I'm a fan of. Here are some great queer authors that I'm a fan of that you should also be looking at. We need diverse books. Like, I'll probably say that 6 times in this interview. That hub of information is like my favorite thing in the absolute world, because that's what it is. And they even have linkage between things. So they'll say, like, if your kid likes Harry Potter, they'll also like Akata Witch, which is basically like the African Harry Potter. You know what I mean? Like, if your kid loves, Anna and the French Kiss, then they'll love Two Boys Kissing. And so I think that is like, I love to send people to that site, because I think it's just like, it's just this wealth of information and direction for kids and for parents as well, because beyond just like giving information and recommendations on books, it's also offering information on the importance of literature and how it's affected and how kids are viewed and seeing themselves, and then links for other information. And then they have all types of like writing contests and internships and things like that for kids to get involved in. They're looking for, marginalized kids to do summer internships at the publishing houses, because guess what? Besides writers, we need people from marginalized communities to become editors, to become the deal brokers that can then understand a manuscript when it's coming into that house and get the importance of it and make sure that it is getting put on the shelf. And so they're grooming a new generation of editors through like summer internship programs and things like that. So it's just this great place for kids to like learn and grow, but not only kids who are seeing themselves reflected for the first time, but kids who are seeing reflections they're not accustomed to for the first time. So yeah, I like to, and there's quite a few sites that are like leaving my brain right now that I like to redirect people to. But even some of the publishers like Scholastic and Sourcebooks, they're getting better at having that kind of information available on their sites as well.
Yeah, well,
parents have to get tasked, because you can't leave them to their own devices. They'll walk away from you and say what they're going to do. But if you make it easy for them and say, go to this website, read these books, then they usually stay the course.
They get on it. I know around the book American Dirt, there was a lot of conversation around not only obviously how that book came to be, but for especially the Latinx community of, we don't have any representation in the publishing houses.
Yeah.
So, so therefore the books that bubble up are not reflective of our shared experiences.
Yeah. And again, that's an adult book. That's where they're doing it bad over there, the grown-ups.
Oh, the grown-up section. Yeah, okay. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Because that would, I'm telling you, that kind of thing has not happened in YA in a long time, just because of what we have a hashtag Own Voices, because of the Own Voices movement. And Jackie Woodson, a legendary kid lit author, made a very good statement, and she said, and she identifies as both Black and queer, and she said, if you have not been privy to the conversations that happen around my grandmother's kitchen table on a Sunday evening, then you have no business telling my story.
Wow, that sums it up. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That should be true for everything. Actually, on that note, I was curious, given talking about your story and the story of this book that you co-wrote, are there thoughts or plans of doing a film out of this, or?
Fingers crossed. We've got some things working, but nothing that we can announce yet. But we're definitely working on it. And it's interesting because I'm also a filmmaker, and so I still pace like a screenwriter, even when I'm writing my novels, which is why this novel is a little shorter. Most YA novels are somewhere between 60 and 100,000 words. This came in right at 45,000 words. And that was also by design, because I wanted kids who are reluctant readers to not feel overwhelmed by it. But it's also because I pace so quickly. I pace like a screenplay that it's a little bit faster. And in the beginning, I would be like super dialogue heavy, and my co-author Gilly would be like, this is not a script, this is a book. You do recognize that. Like,
right.
Where's the interiority?
Narration.
Like, what are they seeing? Yeah, it's like we need the narration. And, but that was one of the things that she and I talk about as well, is that like we leaned on each other's strengths to write this book. So like dialogue is my specialty, but like narration is her specialty. So we would write within each other's chapters once we would finish a chapter. So like I'd like punch up her dialogue and she would like expand out my narration, and I would like change because the girls live in each other's chapters. So I would like change stuff in a Campbell chapter and be like, black girl would never say it like that, let me change this. And she would be like, a white girl would never have that lived experience, let me change this. And so we became to understand very quickly that compromise doesn't always mean meet in the middle. Compromise may mean that one person is just right and you have to give in on that moment, and the book is better served for it.
Wow. And you're like amping up kind of each of those stories in a good way. On authenticity. I'd love to see the film. When I heard it's like 4-hour narrative, I think it's like, that's a movie, that's gonna be a film. I'd love to talk, if we can, in the last few minutes, talk about your video that obviously went viral, and I think millions of people by this point have probably seen. There's a lot to obviously unpack, and you've unpacked it as much as you can in other spaces. But I was just curious if you could, talk a little bit about a few items that you highlighted that stood out to me, and I'm sure lots of other people. One is just the history you highlighted within the Black community, but also within the American history of. You mentioned Tulsa, you mentioned Rosewood. Could you talk a little bit about why you feel like, and again, maybe this wasn't intentional, maybe just in that moment, I know that there was a lot of feeling there, rightfully so, but like, do you think that is important, that historical perspective that sometimes I feel like is either erased or not talked about in our country, is why that's what's so important?
Yeah, I think it's super important that we have like historical context as to how we got here to this moment, right? Like this is the most heightened moment I've seen in my lifetime. You know what I mean? And I'm been on this earth a few decades, and so I think that the historical context of how we've gotten here is super important, and I think that it's been glossed over. And I think the easiest way that it was allowed to be glossed over is because American history is so limited in what is taught in schools, and so there's all these components that, like, it's not really like Black history; it's American history. These are things that happen on American soil. This is an American experience, and so it's not taught in schools. And so if you don't understand the relevancy of these massacres and how they were extremely detrimental to the Black wealth building, that there were these moments where we're kind of like on track with like being comparable to our white counterparts, and there were these massive devastations. Keep in mind, I mentioned two of them. There were over 30 of those styles of massacres that happened. I mean, there was one in Florida, even one in Nova Scotia. And so, and then there are other like atrocities that happened, like Freedmen's Bank. That was the only bank after Reconstruction that allowed African Americans to bank with them. And there was over $50 million between all the banks of Black money. And that money was stolen from those people and used to build American railroads. And so the fact that we're not learning this information, and then the narrative is, why can't Black people just pull themselves up by their bootstraps like everybody else? And it's like, you've had an opportunity to build generational wealth in terms of not only money to pass down, and obviously I'm speaking in broad strokes. Clearly not every white person in America is wealthy. We all know that, you know what I mean?
Right.
But beyond just the actual money, but there has been financial education that has been passed down generationally that Black people didn't have access to because they didn't have access to money, or they lost money and they didn't have the necessary tools to fight. And I challenge people when they say, well, we'll look at people like Oprah and Tyler Perry and they're successful, and I'm like, what I'm fighting for my people is the ability to be mediocre, right? Like these are people who exemplify exceptionalism, and there are people who exemplify exceptionalism in all cultures that have this great ways, but just to live a median income and have a fair shot and not have things like redlining and lack of loan ability for small businesses and things like that available to Black people is these are traditional blockers that are part of systemic racism, that have the median income for an African American family in the US is like $17,000.
Right.
How are people living on $17,000 a year?
Right.
And then you look at how that can like rotate into other situations. So you're making $17,000 a year, you're barely making ends meet. You may have to make a choice between like rent and car insurance, and then you get pulled over and you can't afford to pay that $1,500 ticket, and now you're on probation. And you're having to be on probation for a year for a ticket because you're only making $17,000 a year or less. And so there, the thing about it was there was two, I don't know exactly the number, but like 270 some odd years of slavery in which wealth building was able to done with basically all free labor. And people think that it's not effective to what's happening now, but I won't name any companies because I won't want to get you in trouble. But there are companies where there is generational wealth that has been passed down, and that money was made during slavery time. So that there's been this continual wealth in this family. So if you have to look at that continual pass down of wealth, you have to look at the passed down debt of African American people in this country. And then when you look at the fact that there are over 30 instances of towns where people did exactly that and pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, and there was devastation. I mean, Tulsa was not just like vigilantes. That was the National Guard dropped bombs on them.
Yep. The U.S. government. Yeah, the U.S. government.
Yeah, it was like the U.S. government. And when you look at places like Rosewood and stuff, that was vigilantes, but there was also no consequences for those actions. When you look at the 865 men who were slaughtered when they killed all of the sharecroppers who tried to unionize themselves in Florida, and they killed over 865 sharecroppers, no one served any time for that. There were no consequences. And so you nurtured this thought that there was no consequence, and that was a sentiment passed down by some people, and so that you still see that sentiment now on the streets with police brutality.
Yeah, it's a continuation, as Michelle Alexander calls New Jim Crow. It's an evolution of the same tools.
I couldn't have said it better.
Well, I try. But no, and I just thought that was really powerful, the way that you unpack that, and again, how it's just there's that erasure that we don't seem to be. Hopefully we can change. But, and, you know, Brian Stevenson also talks about this a lot with his work around Equal Justice Initiative of, you know, with lynchings and with the violence perpetrated and still perpetrated on folks, particularly in the South. You know, now we're having the debate again about statues, and, you know, it's like we're one of the few developed countries that seem to be obsessed with continuing to have, you know, emblems of violence and atrocities on the streets in America, right?
It's like, do you not hear that out loud if you say it out loud?
Yeah, right, exactly. A couple of last things, if we have a minute to unpack. You talked about not owning anything. I felt kind of the emotion in your voice when you were saying that. I think a lot of people did, of just, we don't own anything in this country. Would you take a moment just to walk us through, like, maybe just where that came from and what that piece was about?
Yeah, and it's twofold, right? So when I'm talking about ownership, again, people were like, there are plenty of Black business owners, and I'm like, by and large, when you're looking at the numbers, we don't predominantly own things, and especially when you're looking at the proletariat, right? When you're looking like the lower class people of people of color, you're looking at communities where, by and large, like there are not faces that look like them that own anything, and if there are, they're one or two, and normally those businesses don't have the same advantages of other businesses. There are several people in my community who own their business, but they were not able to get business loans, so they're using their 401k to fund their dream, or their life savings to fund their dream, as opposed to having other monies that are available to them. And so the struggle is a lot harder, and they don't have all the necessary tools they need to keep the business going in the way that their white counterparts. Also, there's a piece of it that people are very uncomfortable talking about, because it doesn't feel politically correct, is that we have to talk about a lot of the people who own businesses in those communities treat the people who live in that community as if they are criminal 24 hours and 7 days a week. So they come in there, and there is this, you know, it sounds cliche, but it's true. There are people who, you know, follow you around the store and assume that you're going to steal. The prices are gouged. I mean, the cost of a gallon of milk in a marginalized neighborhood is almost more than $1 more than it is in other spaces, and the quality is often not as good. And so when you look at situations where there's unrest and people are like, why would you harm the store that is in your community? People are not looking at the nuanced conversation of, you know, it's not someone who looks like me that I connect with that own this store, but also that person has had implicit bias and felt free to express it towards me because they knew I had a limitation on options during this time. So, you know, to think that I'm going to have this sympathetic feeling of what's happening to them is not realistic to think about. And the other thing about it is like, we also are not looking at the why. We're not looking at why people are in the financial strains that they are in. And so it's like, if you don't examine that, then you'll find yourself back in those situations again, because we've seen this throughout several unrests, and they continue to happen, and no one has a conversation about the why. So people are back there, you know. Once again, the other thing is there is ownership in terms of small business. And again, like I said, with a few rare cases like Tyler Perry of exceptionalism. But when you look at, by and large, of like movie studios and publishing houses and grocery store chains and like big business, you don't normally see Black owners. You will see some Black people who have worked their tail to the bone and probably worked twice as hard as everybody else who may grow into a CEO position, but there's not ownership. And part of why there isn't ownership at that level and on that scale is because we were blocked from having that level of ownership till as recently as like 30 years ago. And so, and no one is examining though, no one is authentically examining those components when they're having these conversations. They're looking at where they sit right now and not realizing that although this seems so far away, most of this stuff is a generation ago.
Yeah, it was yesterday and today and unfortunately probably tomorrow. And I think, you know, Chris Rock had this point about like, you know, in New Jersey, like he's a wealthy Black man. First of all, no white person wants to trade places, as you said, with a wealthy Black man because he's Black, but also that his Black neighbors are like Denzel Washington and his white neighbors are like a dentist, right?
Exactly. Like exactly. I was just watching this amazing documentary last night on Netflix. Oh God, I'm about to screw up the name, but I think it's called Disclosure.
Yeah, I saw it with Laverne Cox and
Yes. And I was looking at the statistics of like just like, you know, and I know this is like a little bit off the subject, but I feel like there's an interconnectedness there of like trans women and trans men not being able to get employment, yet people being judgy about them becoming sex workers. And it's just like, first of all, if your chosen life is to be a sex worker, I don't understand why that's illegal, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah, but also it's like the judgment of that when we have strategically made sure that trans people can't get employment, it's comical. It's like in those moments, I'm like, it's comical.
Yeah, it goes back to what you're saying. It's focusing on the how and sort of like the what almost instead of the why. Like this country seems to have an amazing ability, as you said, just sort of like every few years, every 20 years, 10 years, they're like, oh, they're looting again. Oh, they're, you know, it's like token representation. They're sex workers again instead of the why of what are the conditions that created these forced realities.
Exactly.
I know almost out of time. I was curious if you could just comment on this quote that I think, I mean, so many people have been moved by, which is you talked about you're lucky, you know, we're lucky that Black people want equality and not revenge. You know, that struck with so many people. I'm just curious if you know, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, sort of where that came from, and maybe what you see as a path going forward for the work that we hopefully all should be doing around racial justice, inclusion, and so forth.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of time what's happened is the, you know, mass scale atrocities like that are watered down to a place of like a blurb, you know, like a paragraph in the history book of schools. And so we're not thinking on it on a human level. And I think that, you know, it's super unfortunate as humankind. Man, I wish we were better as humankind, that we've become so desensitized to these moments that we don't think about how horrific they are. We don't think about how, I mean, when you think about 400 consistent years of oppression, that is extreme. That is extreme. And when you think about things that people were able to get away with, like lynchings and, you know, continuous, like, you know, like rape of Black women and, you know, the 13th Amendment, how that is even still in place and functioning and a real thing. And the amount of African-American men who have since, thank God, through organizations come off of death row for crimes they didn't commit, and we were about to kill them for crimes that they didn't commit. It's like this compounded amount of atrocities that has been, you know, pushed forward on the Black form for a people who have not, you know, in 400 years committed a war or been participant in mass atrocities. And so if anything, we've been most harmful to each other, you know what I mean? And so it's like this notion that we should just be grateful that people allow us to exist is so insulting when you look at the full range of what has happened to us as a culture. So many other, if you had done, you know, if you theoretically done similar disservices to just a family, the family would be ready to come with pitchforks and guns and kill everybody around them. So my thought was, you should consider yourselves lucky that what Black people are saying is we still want to live in harmony and we just want equality, because what revenge would look like would be brutal by comparison to what we've experienced in this country and what we continue to experience in this country. I mean, people watch us get murdered on camera by cops and still debate whether or not it's okay.
Right. Still, there's still sort of we're still in conversation mode. It seems like with the changes that should have happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
I the head nods all around, and I think. Well, I was just going to close, and what you hope might come out of this moment that we're in as a country. If are you hopeful, and if so, why, or and like what should we, particularly, white folks, but not just white folks, what should we as fellow citizens and fellow human beings be doing for each other in this moment?
Well, I will say this, I'm super hopeful. I look at this movement that, it doesn't surprise me that it came on the back of a pandemic. And so everyone kind of like had their eyes open and paying attention. But to see a global movement of this scale, which I've never seen anything like this really in my lifetime, to see a global movement of this scale makes me realize that we have stepped out of allyship, which again, Dr. Breonna McDaniel, who I love, talks about the difference between being an ally and being an accomplice. And I think we have stepped into a realm where people are more being accomplices. They are willing to sacrifice themselves and risk their own comfort in order to help their fellow man. So that to me has been the most promising thing that I've seen. But I think now that we've had this awakening and the roar of the people, and I love that this has been a movement of the people. We haven't needed celebrity or government officials to get involved in this. The people have said, no, I got this. I don't need anybody. We have a lot to say about a lot of things, and we're about to say it. I think now that we've done that, it's time to move into like more organizing, even on small scales. And I think the main thing that we're going to have to do is start to, continue to vote at a large scale, but also we can't stop at voting. We're going to have to flip some of these seats. Some of these people who share very ugly sentiments have been in Congress and Senate for 50 years, and we already know what generation they come from and what their ideals are. And so we need to get them out of there. So we need to get super proactive about getting new, young energy in Congress and in the Senate. And we have to be active about that, and we have to be looking at candidates that are viable candidates that can take these seats, and we have to put our money where our mouth is and make sure these people are getting elected. And we know that when you're looking at the African American community in particular, that this issue, which is why I feel like my Monopoly analogy hit people so hard, is that a lot of this issue is rooted in economic disparagement. So we have to look at programming that's going to kind of start trying to close the gap on economic disparagement with Black people and other people in this nation. And we need to like circulate the Black dollar, and we need to support Black businesses, and we need to set up, programming that allow Black businesses to thrive. Because again, if people do the research, they'll realize how much we've made a point to not make that be a thing, and the amount of people that we've been allowed to like shuffle into like modern day slavery in the prison system is insane. And we need to pull up more of those cases. We need more than just the Innocence Project and 3 or 4 other projects that are taking care of that. We need a government center that is dealing with, now that we have DNA, going back and retrying some of these cases and making sure that people who should have been free a long time ago are getting free.
Yeah, and having spent some time doing like civil rights work and on cold cases even. I mean, there's so many of those cases that were never solved, never addressed. There's been, as you point out, like no truth. And so how can there be reconciliation until we confront it? So yeah, I agree. Vote and get involved, especially now. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly, for doing this. We're incredibly grateful, and I hope folks do read your book, and also hopefully get your nails with some cool art soon. So
yes.
We'll post links to all the work you're doing on our pages. So thanks again for doing this.
I appreciate you. Thank you. This was awesome. I can't wait to see it.